Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the Rocket Hub. My name is Philip and today we are starting a new mini-series on rocket fuels. Part 1, the video which you are currently watching, focuses mainly on hydrogen, and part 2 will do the same with methane. As always, the videos are broken up into chapters with their respective timestamps on screen right now. With all of that said, let's start. When constructing a new rocket, the question of what propellant to use is often the very first one to be asked. Rightly so, after all, the choice of propellant dictates certain design elements for both the vehicle and the engine, and has a major impact on overall performance. The fuel a rocket runs on actively shapes how the final vehicle design will look like and what it will be capable of. Each rocket fuel brings along a certain set of individual properties, both advantageous and disadvantageous. But when comparing every modern rocket fuel, hydrogen is often regarded as the perfect fuel. At least that is what is always taught in documentaries, books and space-related media. Hydrogen is just by far the best option.
Now, two gases do that better than any other. I was assistant to put together officially. His name was Werner von Braun, and the two gases he released from his particular version of thermostat, the one lying beside me now, were hydrogen and oxygen.
Well, that is not the entire truth. In this video, we will go through all the different requirements a rocket fuel has to fulfill, what options we have, and why hydrogen appears to be the best choice. However, the second half of this video will quite evidently show that why that, in fact, isn't the case. Before we can analyze the advantages and problems of using hydrogen as a rocket fuel, we first have to define the different requirements that a potential propellant mixture for an orbital rocket engine has to fulfill. And of course, we are talking about chemical propulsion systems here, since no other propellant type has made it to orbit yet or is expected to do so in the near future. And also, be careful to not confuse fuel with propellant in this segment, since these are two completely different things. Fuel is only the material that is actually being burned together with an oxidizer. For example, a hydrogen-powered rocket engine burns hydrogen as its fuel along with an oxidizer. Propellant, on the other hand, refers to the fluid burned in a combustion chamber, which includes both the actual fuel and the oxidizer, most commonly liquid oxygen. Since chemical rocket propulsion is based on the energy created by the combustion of propellant, the first and most important requirement for rocket fuels is that they must be able to react exothermically with some sort of oxidizer, meaning it has to be the reductive component of a redox reaction. That already eliminates a lot of candidates. Furthermore, we want our chemical reaction to run continuously, so we don't have to constantly ignite the fuel oxidizer mixture again and again. Although that isn't necessarily a must-have property, it comes in very handy. Those few criteria are already enough to narrow the possible choices down to just a few fuel and oxidizer mixtures. But not all of them are ideal. The few suitable rocket fuels are alcohol, hydrogen, methane, kerosenes and similar hydrocarbons, a variety of hypergolic fuels including many different forms of hydrazine. And honestly, that is about it for liquid rocket fuels out there. Of course, there are solid fuels and certain form of hybrid propellants, but we have already tackled that topic in the previous deep dive video, so we will only consider liquid fuels in this video. So now we know what makes a rocket fuel a rocket fuel. All the propellant mixtures that fulfill the requirements listed earlier are potential rocket propellants. But to actually pick one of these fuels to power a rocket, we need to look at a few chemical properties of the potential rocket fuels. Those are mainly related to how efficient a fuel combusts, be it in terms of burn ratio, volume or specific impulse, its melting and boiling points, its density and its combustion temperature. Also important are other non-numerical values such as cost, suitability to reuse and even environmental impact. The maximum theoretical specific impulse a rocket fuel provides is extremely important. Specific impulse is an often used way of expressing the combustion efficiency of a rocket engine and their fuel. It basically describes how many seconds a given engine, or in our case, a perfectly combusted liquid fuel, can accelerate using a propellant mass of 1 kilogram. You can think of the specific impulse as the rocketry version of a car's fuel efficiency. Next comes density, and connected to it, the burn ratio of the given fuel and its oxidizer. This directly influences the size a rocket must have to store all the propellant inside that is needed to get to orbit. Therefore, it also indirectly influences the maximum thrust output a rocket can achieve, since a higher density allows for a higher fuel load and therefore a higher mass flow rate and higher thrust, but that correlation is somewhat complicated. Along with the density of the fuel goes the burn ratio, which has pretty similar consequences. After all, the ratio of fuel and oxidizer together with the respective density determines the size of both tanks. Next up are boiling and melting points of the rocket fuels. They also have an influence on both tank size and especially the dry mass of a rocket, since we want to keep our propellants in their liquid form. Therefore, we need to know the temperature window in which our fuel and also oxidizer are liquid. If the storage temperature is, as often the case, below 120 Kelvin or minus 152 degrees Celsius, the fuel is referred to as a cryogenic fuel. These fuels are so cold that they need additional insulation to keep them in their liquid form. Another temperature that is of extreme importance is the combustion temperature of a given fuel oxidizer mixture. Since we want to get as much energy from the chemical reactions happening inside our engines as possible, those temperatures are hot. Really hot. In fact, it isn't even that uncommon for the combustion temperatures of liquid propellant rocket engines to exceed 3000 degrees Celsius. Therefore, we need complicated cooling systems for our engines to keep them from melting. And depending on which fuel we use, these cooling systems add weight to the rocket, put the engines under more or less stress and so on, meaning a lower combustion temperature is definitely advantageous. These are all the physical properties that determine a rocket's design if we are only trying to get the engineering right. Finding a rocket fuel that performs well in all categories isn't easy, and often it is actually better to make compromises. But we are living in the 21st century now, and the physics alone isn't all that matters anymore. Our rocket fuel must fulfill certain other requirements to truly be suitable for an economic and sustainable access to space. The very first and probably by far most important factor of these, at least somewhat non-physical factors, is the fuel's cost. After all, we can't just burn unlimited amounts of money launching rockets. And no, we will ignore the existence of SLS for now, okay? A relatively cheap fuel can be pretty advantageous in a steadily growing launch market with many competing providers, and is therefore potentially as important as the on-paper properties of a rocket fuel. Also important are combustion products and the environmental impact of a rocket, which is solely determined by the fuel it uses. The stuff that is expelled from the bottom of the rocket can be pretty nasty and therefore cause damage to both ecosystems and the Earth's atmosphere. While being environmentally friendly isn't required for any rocket, trying to not destroy our planet as a side effect of spaceflight may be a good idea. Combustion byproducts have a far more important consequence. In an era where reusability is slowly becoming the defining factor of new rocket design, the implications the burning of rocket fuel has for both the vehicle and its engines are getting more and more important. And since combustion temperature, combustion byproducts and the pure chemical properties of the fuel and its oxidizer are all factors for potential reusability, this value is also non-numerical. And these 9 factors are only the most important ones. There are even more requirements out there, depending on what exact mission set the vehicle has to fulfill. For example, SpaceX chose methane as the preferred fuel for the future due to it being accessible on Mars, since Starship is designed for interplanetary missions. But to get an overview on rocket fuels, these 9 factors should be considered since they are pretty disconnected from specific mission sets. And that is all we need to know about rocket fuel theory to get us a clear picture of hydrogen as a rocket fuel. So let's do exactly that. Hydrogen, also sometimes referred to as H2, is the very first atom in the periodic system of elements and has the atomic number of 1. Hydrogen is commonly used as rocket fuel since the 1960s and has seen a lot of usage over the years. Therefore, all the stats we need to know of to assess its viability as a rocket fuel are pretty well known. The main reason hydrogen is used as a rocket fuel this often is because of its energy density. Hydrogen in its elementary form, which for reasons I won't explain right now is H2, carries a whopping 142 megajoules of energy per kilogram. That is the highest value of all known elements. But what does energy density mean for the overall performance of our rocket fuel? Well, a molecule's energy density is what determines the maximum theoretical ISP we can get from it. This value describes the absolute highest specific impulse that you can draw from a propellant, the theoretical limit in perfect combustion. And since hydrogen has the highest energy density of all elements, it also has the highest known maximum theoretical ISP of any liquid rocket fuel. With a max ISP of 532 seconds, hydrogen outclasses all the other potential chemical fuels by at least 10%. Although this value is impossible to achieve due to physical limitations, hydrogen-fueled engines such as the Aerojet Rocketdyne J2 and RS-25 have reached specific impulses of over 450 seconds. For our first stat, hydrogen doesn't only look good, it is literally the best. So how does it perform in terms of burn ratio and density? Well, nobody is perfect, hydrogen included. Since hydrogen is literally the smallest of all atoms, it is extremely undense. The mean density of hydrogen at standard temperature is 0.09 grams per liter. That is almost nothing. Even when in liquid state, hydrogen still has a density of only 70.85 kilograms per cubic meter. That is still a terribly bad value. But the low fuel density alone isn't actually that big of a problem. The decisive factor is the burn ratio, or how much fuel we need to burn for every liter of oxidizer. Should that ratio be close to 0, a low density isn't that big of a problem. But hydrogen, which is typically burned together with liquid oxygen or O2, has a burn ratio of 6:1. For every liter of oxygen we use, we burn through 6 liters of hydrogen. So our hydrogen tank has to be large. Very large. And having more dry mass isn't something you want anywhere in rocketry. But although certainly not advantageous, hydrogen's low density and high burn ratio aren't the end. There are still 6 more factors to go through after all. When looking at the melting and boiling points of hydrogen, its position in the periodic table strikes once again. Since larger molecules typically have higher melting and boiling points, being this tiny brings these points for hydrogen down a lot. Due to having a melting point of just 14 degrees above absolute zero and a boiling point of a mere 20.2 Kelvin, hydrogen must be kept extremely cold to remain in liquid state. That does not only require infrastructure that is able to handle the hydrogen at the launch site, but also additional insulation on the launch vehicle to avoid the hydrogen from heating up and eventually boiling off. Although engineers have learned how to keep the hydrogen cold enough over the years, This still causes a few problems, but that is for later. So now we have one category in which hydrogen is the best and three where it is basically the worst. Since hydrogen is often considered to be the best rocket fuel, there have to be a lot more advantageous properties to it than just the highest specific impulse. And indeed, there are. One of them is hydrogen's combustion temperature, which is among the lowest I could find for any rocket fuels. Hydrogen combusts with oxygen at just 3070 Kelvin. Don't get me wrong, that's still immensely high, but when compared to other rocket fuels like kerosene or methane, this number is hundreds of degrees lower. An engine running on hydrogen therefore requires less cooling systems and weighs less than engines running on different fuels, at least on paper. For the numerical factors, hydrogen gets mixed results. It either is the best of them or just the worst. It actually always lies at one of the extremes. But as we discussed earlier, there are a few more non-numerical categories we need to evaluate hydrogen in. As for fuel cost, hydrogen for the very first time scores somewhere in the middle. Since liquid hydrogen is produced through the electrolysis of water, the building blocks for it are abundant on Earth. But the insane amounts of electricity needed to split up water into hydrogen and oxygen and to keep it all cool dramatically increases the fuel cost of hydrogen. In the end, liquid hydrogen costs around about $3.66 per kilogram. At least that is the price NASA bought it for the space shuttle. That's quite expensive, but still acceptable and cheaper than some other rocket fuels. Also, at least for current launch market, fuel costs still aren't the most important factor, since excessive use of those fuels can bring the price down by a lot. Next up are combustion byproducts and environmental impact. Since hydrogen is artificially created through electrolysis and stored as liquid H2, it barely includes any contaminations and therefore burns extremely clean. Almost all exhaust generated by a hydrogen-fueled engine is water vapor or gaseous H2O. The only other thing in the exhaust plume of a hydrogen-powered vehicle are some nitrogen oxides, but these are always created whenever the air surrounding a vehicle is heated up that drastically. Therefore, every rocket engine leaves behind a few nitrogen oxides. Not only is water vapor, as the pretty much exclusive combustion product, as environmentally friendly as a rocket could possibly be, it is suited quite well for usability as well. Hydrogen burns so clean that there is literally zero possibility for coking or other processes threatening to damage the engine other than the combustion temperatures themselves. And since these are very low for cryogenic rocket fuel, hydrogen offers pretty good opportunities in terms of usability. Hydrogen is the most efficient rocket fuel, well suited for usability, burning environmentally friendly, and doesn't overstress its engines. It only has a few challenges involving density and storage temperature and resulting infrastructure, but there are always ways around that. So hydrogen looks quite good as rocket fuel, doesn't it? Well, admittedly it does, on paper. Everything we discussed so far is pure theory, and as often the case, theory doesn't apply fully in real life. We now know why hydrogen is often used as a rocket fuel and can follow arguments claiming it to be the optimal rocket fuel. After all, it is the most efficiently burning of them all. But this video isn't about why hydrogen can be considered the best rocket fuel, but why it may actually be the worst. And that has a lot to do with the real-world engineering instead of theoretical physics, as we discussed already. On paper, hydrogen has three main disadvantages: density, burn ratio, and storage temperatures. Although they seem manageable in theory, the real consequences of these three factors are far more severe than the stats alone may suggest. Let's start with the easiest one: hydrogen's storage temperature. Keeping a liquid at below 20 Kelvin or negative 253 degrees Celsius certainly isn't easy. Not only does the launch site need to be able to actively chill the hydrogen down, but also be able to store and transfer the fuel without it boiling off. That alone is quite the challenge, considering that everything must function perfectly, or the hydrogen might turn to a gas again and potentially rupture the fuel lines used. And it doesn't get any better on the vehicle side of things. Let's take a look at the probably most famous hydrogen-powered rocket, the Space Shuttle. To power the three RS-25 main engines on the orbiter, the shuttle required a large external tank housing all of its hydrogen and oxygen. This tank had to be encased in a thick layer of special thermally insulating foam that was sprayed onto the tank to keep the hydrogen from boiling off. Not only did this foam add quite a lot of dry mass to the external tank, it also posed a safety risk for the entire vehicle and its crew. As you may or may not know, the foam regularly froze due to the insanely cold temperatures inside the tank coming into contact with the humidity in the air around. And since a rocket launch causes a lot of vibrations, the frozen foam tended to break off the tank in chunks. That is exactly what caused the fatal foam strike that led to the loss of Columbia in 2003. And this tragic accident wasn't even the first time this has happened. Although one could argue that this issue was purely related to the Space Shuttle's design, the major problems involving keeping the hydrogen cold are shared by all hydrogen-powered vehicles. However, the problems involving the usage of hydrogen as a rocket fuel are far from over. Instead, they're only getting worse. We already know that hydrogen has both a terribly low density and a high burn ratio. Both factors alone would already cause the tank size to increase dramatically, but together the results are straight up horrible. Let's take a second look at the Space Shuttle's external tank, or rather, inside it. This is a cut open view of the external tank displaying what is inside. Can you spot the problem? Well, the hydrogen tank at the bottom of the external tank is way larger than the tiny oxygen tank at the top. In fact, the hydrogen tank makes up almost the entire thing. The enormous size of the external tank structure was mostly caused by hydrogen having a catastrophically low density. And the external tank of the Space Shuttle isn't even the only example here. Just take a look at the Delta IV Heavy. Derived from the Delta IV Medium launcher, this heavy lift rocket uses three almost identical hydrogen-powered boosters on the first stage and another hydrogen-powered second stage. Actually, the Delta IV Heavy was, when considering just the size, the world's largest rocket for quite some time. But despite being a tiny bit larger than SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, which is running on kerosene, the Delta IV Heavy only lifts about half the payload mass of Falcon Heavy and is considerably lighter. You might have guessed it by now, but that also is a result of the required hydrogen having such a large volume. Increasing the rocket size is actually pretty painful and hurts the efficiency of the vehicle, something that should technically get better by using hydrogen as fuel. But since the tanks must house more volume due to hydrogen's low density, our old friend, the rocket equation, strikes again. Every bit of added structure increases the vehicle's dry mass and requires more fuel to get into orbit, hurting payload mass and efficiency of the rocket. But there is one more issue involving hydrogen that can't even be truly visualized or grasped in numbers. Hydrogen just is a pain in the ass to handle, both inside the vehicle and on the pad infrastructure. Since hydrogen in its H2 form, as it is used in rocketry, is by far the smallest molecule in existence, microscopic cracks or gaps in fuel pipes, valves, engine manifolds, quick disconnect assemblies and God knows what else are enough to make the hydrogen leak out. And if it does leak out, you probably can imagine what happens upon engine ignition. Hydrogen boiling off and mixing with the air around the rocket is a perfect recipe for disaster. However, hydrogen having a tendency to leak wouldn't even be that big of an issue if it wouldn't happen this often. The fact that a crack, not even visible to the naked eye, is enough to endanger the entire mission when remaining undetected is just insane. Therefore, hydrogen-powered vehicles often have to stand down from launch attempts since their fuel just doesn't want to stay inside. that is exactly what happened to SLS back in last October when it got its launch attempt scrapped due to hydrogen leaking out of a quick disconnect port connecting rocket and pad. But a single example doesn't make a general issue for all hydrogen-powered vehicles. Well, of course, there are more examples. After all, the Space Shuttle had flown a full 135 missions under the power of hydrogen. And during 3 decades of service, the shuttle also had its fair share of issues with hydrogen leaks. Out of a total of 121 scraps, at least 33 were directly related to hydrogen leaking out of the system. That's almost 30% of all scraps, with the STS-35 and 38 missions being particularly bad with multiple rollbacks and tanking tests each. And keep in mind, the shuttle was a well figured out system that flew multiple times a year for decades, so we should expect those rates for any vehicle running on hydrogen. If we included scraps due to hydrogen related hardware failing, these numbers would increase even further. As you can see, hydrogen is far from ideal. If we consider real-life handling characteristics and engineering challenges of hydrogen, it may be questionable whether the advantages of burning hydrogen are truly worth the challenge. Over the course of this video, we have learned about the physical and chemical characteristics of hydrogen and found both its advantages and disadvantages when regarding on-paper performance. We also covered the problems arising when using hydrogen as a rocket fuel and how the real-life troubles of handling it impacted past vehicles. So, considering all of this, is hydrogen a good rocket fuel? Well, yes and no. Hydrogen is by far the most efficient rocket fuel out there, but that is made up by its low density, letting a rocket's dry mass skyrocket. It is the most environmentally friendly fuel, but it escapes the system very easily. Hydrogen is perfectly suitable for reusing rocket components, but really expensive. There are always two sides to it. From an engineering perspective, using hydrogen on the first stage of a vehicle is kind of a bad idea. To leave the atmosphere and overcome gravity, we need thrust, not efficiency. The added dry mass induced by using hydrogen on a first stage actually hurts the vehicle's performance. However, for second stages, hydrogen is a more than just viable option. An extremely high specific impulse and reduced fuel consumption make hydrogen a way better option for in-space propulsion. It all depends on how we want to use hydrogen. But one thing we won't be ever able to do is escaping the ever-returning troubles of hydrogen leaking out of the system and having to be kept at just 20 Kelvin. Hydrogen is an extremely annoying rocket fuel, and should we decide to make use of it more in the future, we just have to accept that. Hydrogen definitely isn't the wonder fuel some experts make it out to be. Yes, it is the best option on paper, but the everlasting problems involving its use make it hard to actually benefit from these advantages. When compared to other options like kerosene or, spoilers, methane, hydrogen is just not the best choice. Admittedly, calling this video why hydrogen is the worst rocket fuel is a bit clickbaity. Hydrogen certainly isn't the worst rocket fuel of all, but far worse than often depicted. But despite that, hydrogen will probably prevail and be used on many vehicles in the future. Although its use on first stages may finally come to an end once NASA finally abandons SLS in a few years in the future. However, the space launch industry seems to slowly be switching away from hydrogen, even for second stages, with a few exceptions as the upcoming ULA Vulcan. But should we be able to develop technology that enables easier handling of hydrogen, we may, together with advanced lightweight materials, be on the cusp of a hydrogen renaissance. And that's it for part 1 of my rocket fuel mini-series. Let me know down in the comments how you feel about hydrogen and its usage as a rocket fuel, and if you enjoyed the video, which I really hope you did, why don't you hit the like button and subscribe to Rocket Hub. If so, Thank you for your support. We see ourselves in the next video, and until then, I'm out. Cheers!